Have you ever wondered why some foods are closely associated with Juneteenth? Well, today we're going to talk about it. And if you have your own questions, you can reach out to me at onemikehistory.com in the contacts page. Also, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on my Buy Me Coffee on my Patreon page in the description below. Give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's get started. Juneteenth is the annual celebration of the emancipation of those that were enslaved in the United States by recalling the day that marked the final liberation of those that were enslaved. Over time, it has become a significant aspect of African American culture, and it's now being celebrated throughout the United States, with the hallmark feature being festivals and the sharing of a variety of foods which have a long-standing affiliation with the African American experience. The origins of Juneteenth can be traced back to the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, in which all enslaved people in the Confederate States were released from slavery. Despite the proclamation, an immense number of African Americans in Texas remained in bondage until June 19, 1865, when Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston, Texas, and declared that every person should be set free. That date is honored as Juneteenth. For one to understand the importance of Juneteenth, you have to understand the history of African Americans and their foods. During slavery, African Americans were denied the implementation of their culture and thus resorted to food as an expression of their cultural heritage. This is especially true with foods during Juneteenth. These foods are deeply rooted in the African American experience. Foods like barbecue, watermelon, and collard greens are all traditional dishes and reflect the resilience of the African American people. These dishes not only provided sustenance, but also served as a symbol of pride, courage, and strength and the perseverance of African Americans in the face of adversity. Watermelon, for example, is a staple food for African Americans during slavery. It was easily cultivated in hot, humid climates of the southern United States and was one of the few fruits that were available to enslaved people. Plantation owners often allowed them to cultivate and sell their own, and they were also often given watermelon to celebrate during July 4th. After emancipation, watermelon became a symbol of Juneteenth and a reminder of the freedom that African Americans sought for. Formerly enslaved individuals would often avoid sharecropping on white-owned plantations by growing, consuming, and selling their own watermelon. This led to watermelon being seen as a symbol of pride long before the negative stereotype of watermelon being associated with Black people. Another popular food is barbecue, and it's also rooted in African American tradition of pit cooking. This method involved burying pits of hot coals within which the foods would be cooked. Enslaved Africans arrived in the American colonies as early as the 1600s, and by the 1700s, African Americans were the go-to barbecue cooks. And this type of barbecue is a culmination of African, European, and indigenous meat cooking and seasoning techniques. Enslaved people were responsible for the most difficult and laborious tasks that included digging pits, chopping wood, butchering, and processing and cooking the animals. This is how they were able to learn and perfect their craft over centuries. During that time, any animal could be cooked in a pit. It could be a quartered cow, goat, a possum, a raccoon, or even a sheep. Following emancipation, African Americans moved to various corners of the nation and took their Southern barbecue techniques with them. Subsequently, they continued to use the same cooking techniques while incorporating their own regional ingredients and flavors to the barbecue craft that is now linked to Juneteenth. Collard greens also has a long history of being associated with the experience of enslaved people in the United States. Greens originated in Greece, but it wasn't until the first Africans arrived in Jamestown, Virginia in the early 1600s that America was first introduced to the green leafy vegetable. Collard greens were one of the few vegetables that, once again, African Americans were allowed to cultivate for their own consumption. Resilient to a variety of climates and able to be harvested multiple times, collard greens were easy to store during the winter and could be cooked in a variety of ways. Boiling with pork fat or bacon was a popular method of seasoning the dish and adding flavor and protein to make it more filling. The popularity of collard greens spread throughout the South, making it a staple of many diets. After African Americans' emancipation, their love of greens continued, and they kept handing down their well-developed recipes for greens from one generation to the next. Even white Southerners began eating collard greens and found out what African Americans had known for generations. They were delicious. Additionally, the tradition of red foods and drink were another major way to commemorate Juneteenth. The practice can be traced back to West African origins. Historians believe that the symbolic meaning of the color red can also be associated with strength, spirituality, and life and death in many West African cultures, and that enslaved people brought that with them across the Atlantic alongside their knowledge of food. Two West African plants, the kola nut and the hibiscus, were imported to the Caribbean and the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade. Slave owners observed the kola nut being used as an energizer and a digestive or cold remedy, while the hibiscus flowers were steeped to make a reddish purple tea called bissap. When the kola nut was crushed into a powder and then added to water, it created a reddish-brown refreshing drink. The practice of adding red-hue ingredients to make a sweet, palatable drink was common, particularly in the southern United States. After emancipation, Black families often prepared homemade teas and lemonade that were infused with cherries or strawberries or other red fruits. Additionally, they would also preserve these fruits in a syrup made of vinegar or water, which could then be further sweetened and mixed with other beverages. By the late 1880s, food coloring became widely available and was used to create sodas like the Texas-made Big Red, and then carbonated drinks quickly became a popular part of Juneteenth culinary culture. Lastly, another red food that has its roots in African American culture is red velvet cake. This dessert was believed to be originated in the 1880s as a luxury food for wealthy plantation owners in the South. It is thought that red velvet cake is an adaptation of a European cake that used beetroot to color the cake. Over time, the distinctive flavor and color became a symbol of celebration. Its red hue is said to be homage to the blood shed by slaves during that period. Surprisingly, the original hue of red velvet cake was not as vivid as it is today. It originally had a reddish-brown tint due to the chemical reaction between the brown sugar, the buttermilk, and the vinegar. Food coloring was later added to the recipe to give it its distinct color, although the exact time and place of its introduction is unknown. But one theory is that red velvet cake made its debut at the Waldorf Astoria in Manhattan in 1959. Another is that a housewife dissatisfied with the color of the cake added red food coloring to the batter. Another theory is that a baker created a vivid red color in order to make a profit from the cake on Valentine's Day. Regardless of how the color came about, after emancipation, red velvet cake became a popular treat and is now associated with the holiday. The legacy of Juneteenth foods is a rich and vibrant one. From pit barbecue to watermelon to red velvet cake, Juneteenth is a holiday that brings people together as a reminder of the strength and beauty of African Americans. Although its origins of the holiday are rooted in sorrow, Juneteenth is a celebration of freedom, and it can be felt with every single Juneteenth celebration. So as you enjoy these foods this holiday, it serves as a reminder of the history behind it and those enslaved Africans who finally achieved the freedom that they deserved. Thank you. I'm your host, Country Boy, and this has been One Mic History. And if you have questions or you just want to leave your comments, like I said, you can do so at onemichistory.com in the contact page. Thank you for listening, and peace.